I'm going to talk about copper, as Ellis led you to know. Nice pun, by the way. I'm the mercenary geologist, basically geologist for hire. You can find me at mercenarygeologist.com. My Twitter feed is at mercenarygeo. 61,000 Twitter followers, about 6,500 subscribers to my newsletter. Disclaimer, you know it, but I got to say it. Nothing I say can be construed as investment advice or an offer to buy or sell any financial instrument. I'm a contrarian. I've been a contrarian. That's the way I made money in this business for nigh on 25 years in bull and bear markets. Of course, you know where we are. We're in Vancouver, and it's been lovely here lately. So I left the sunshine of New Mexico, and I came to the sunshine in Vancouver, and you can't say that very often. Here's a 14-year spot copper price, and you ask me why 14 years? Well, this is the only daily data that we are able to access without paying Thomson Reuters 10 grand for their database. So this is a copper chart, and it starts in 03, which is, by mid-03 we had a bull market for gold, but it took a while for that to filter down into the industrial metals. In fact, it basically took until mid 2005 before we saw a viable copper price to support development of new copper mines. The blip on your radar screen in January of 07, really not sure why that happened. I can't remember why that happened, but it was a spike down. Copper immediately recovered, and it averaged, if you look between, say, 06 and through the middle of 2008, right before the global economic crisis, copper averaged somewhere around $4 a pound, $3.75, $4 a pound. We had the blip on the screen, which was the global economic crisis, and what led the world's economy out of that, and during the depth of that, copper hit $1.28, now that's not sustainable, was metals, commodity, demand from China mainly. And the reason for that is China quantitatively eased, whatever the hell that means, its way out of the global financial crisis by building infrastructure. They didn't issue a lot of yuan. They didn't take on a bunch of debt where their central bank, they issued bonds and the central bank buys them back the way we did in the U.S. and Europe. They bought commodities. That peaked in January of 2011, but the bull market for metals really continued into the beginning of 2013, and as you see, it's been downhill ever since. And the reasons for that are many, but really it was the slowdown in the Chinese economy. China now consumes well over 40% of the world's copper. We hit rock bottom last January 20th of 2016, when all commodities bottomed. That's when oil bottomed, gold bottomed, copper bottomed. So you can see that on the chart. That would be about the end of January of 2016. And we've had this bounce lately. So now what we're going to do is look at the 1-year price, and I'll show you what's going on there and why I think the price would behave the way they have. What happened on November 8th? We had a new president. What happened on November 9th? Price of copper spiked upward. So that all had to do with the Trump infrastructure build out. So we had a very low copper price hovering around this $2.10, $2.20, a base established by that. We spike up, we spike down, but the copper price has been fairly sustainable at $2.50 to $2.70 since Trump was elected. And so the idea Trump's going to build out infrastructure, similar to what China did in 2009, has really spurred the industrial metals market. price is sustained right now at about 255 to 260. Copper supply demand fundamentals. This is all data from the International Copper Study Group for 2015, which once again is the latest data I can get unless I want to pay $5,000 for this year's study, and I'm not going to do that. So world mine supply, 19.1 million tons. World refined production, total refinery production, oxide and sulfide, 22.9 million tons. And you noticed how balanced the copper market is. 23 million tons demand last year. This supply demand has been in balance for now on from 2007 through 2016, so basically 10 years. Every year a small surplus or a small deficit, usually a small deficit because of disruptions, strikes, weather, port accidents, rains in Chile, et cetera, et cetera. I want to show you how copper production has increased since the world started becoming electrified in 1900. 3.4% annual growth per year. And if you look, an interesting thing is oxide copper, the SXEW, the high-level oxide copper. That process basically was invented, heap leach SXEW, in the late 60s and early 70s, and mainly in Arizona, U.S. Bureau Mines. First production, Rancher's Mine, Bluebird Mine in Miami, Arizona in 1971-72. But look at the acceleration in growth starting about 1990, and that has been mainly from oxide copper deposits. And that's important for later ideas of where the price is going. Copper mine production still dominated by Chile, but less so than it was 10 years ago. The Chilean decline in copper production will continue, in my opinion. It will not be as drastic as, say, what happened to South Africa in gold from the 1990s into the 2010s, but I think we are going to continue to see a decline in relative production, percentage production from Chile. China is growing, but they don't have that many good copper deposits. The real growth and the real problem with the copper market over the last couple of years has been a 50% increase in production from Peru, mainly in Antamina, but also Cerro Verde and Las Bambas. And so that has upset the apple cart a bit. We had this long sustained bull market for copper, and as commonly happens, we had a build out of copper producers and things coming online just at the time that Chinese demand started to come off. So I think this copper, low copper price, the fact that we had more production than was really demanded, and a lot of that is the swing market, and that happens in the scrap market. I think that's going to rectify itself soon. Copper smelter production, this illustrates the growth in Chinese and also Asian smelters over the last 10 or 15 years. And China now refines something on the order of 40% of the world's copper. Refined copper production, so how's that broken down? Well, you have primary sulfide production from concentrates. You have the SXEW, which basically makes 99.99% pure copper cathode at the mine site, refined on site. And then we have the refinery secondary, and that's scrap, and that's not recycled scrap. That's scrap from filings and machines and lathes and waste copper that is then put back into rod and ball mills and reconstituted. So anyway, you see the growth of copper. I mean, look at it. I was a child in 1960, and the world's using 4 million tons of copper a year. Now we're using 23 million tons of copper a year. So here we go, this standard growth. And we'll get to some reasons why on that coming up soon. I mentioned the copper and supply-demand balance and how this has basically been imbalanced with very little perturbations over the last 10 years now. Now, the 2016 data is coming, but I can guarantee you the market was in very small deficit last year. Here's the key slide here. This is the key factoid, and this plots the world's population from 1950, when we were at about 2.7 billion people. We are now at 7.3 billion people. And also plotted there in the jagged line is the copper consumption per person on the planet. So not only are we adding a lot more people to the planet every year, the average copper budget is increasing, and it has really started to increase since about 2000 and you see the steepening of the curve starting in 1990, but a lot of this growth is demand from people that don't have electricity that are now being electrified. So this is a key component of why I am a copper bull in the mid to long term. Metals market fundamentals. A lot of this is driven not by the BRICS, because Russia is not a growing economy. The demographics of Russia, it's a bunch of old people. And so there's not a lot of demand coming from Russia. But the BRICS, Brazil, India, Indonesia, China, and their brethren, that would include all the other emerging market countries in the world. That is where the copper market is growing significantly. It's also growing in the U.S. We used 2% more copper last year. We'll use a significant more amount of copper if Trump gets his infrastructure build-out plans going. So what's the deal here? Well, deposits are tougher to find. Mines are much harder to develop now. So we have this lag time. All the easily found copper deposits in the world have already been found. Now we're getting to the tougher stuff. We have geopolitics with corrupt and unstable governments and resource nationalism. Everywhere you go in the world now, you have environmental and aboriginal opposition. For sure will raise its head. We have all these U.S.-funded NGOs that permeate the world, and that's not going to end anytime soon. So when I first started giving this talk, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, and it evolves over those years, I had a slide that said exploration and development timeline was 10 to 15 years. Now I've kicked that out to 15 to 20 years, and it can be that long. What really is happening now with the year-over-year annual growth that we know is going to occur, it's occurred most years since 1900, we are having supply shortfalls. We will have supply shortfalls. So this is the new copper required per year. Who's going to tell me where this is? And it can't be a geologist, okay? Where is that? The world's oldest open pit copper mines still producing. No, Bingham Canyon, Utah, the first porphyry copper developed by Daniel Jackling in 1903, continuously producing for 114 years now. This mine has mined in its lifetime somewhere around 18 to 19 million tons of copper metal. That's what we use in the world every year. We've got to find one of these giant mines. I mean, this is, if not the biggest man-made excavation on the planet, it's the second biggest. Chuquicamata might be bigger, I'm not sure. But this is visible from the friggin' moon, so we've got to find that much copper every year. World refined copper usage, and this is a replay of a slide I showed previously from 1900. And notice the steepening of the curve starting in 1990. So we're using more and more copper every year. Where will it come from? You tell me. Where's the new copper going to come from? North and South America, we have the world's best copper deposits, or the greatest number of the world's best copper deposits. Those are mature provinces. There are no more outcropping copper ore bodies left around that have not been discovered and drilled out. The DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Southwest Pacific, very good copper deposit. DRC, arguably the best copper and cobalt deposits in the world, but they're geopolitically untenable. Ask all the companies that went far and far away in the last boom and how many got basically burned by what I call second and third world resource nationalism. So where are people moving? They're coming back to places like the good old US of A, where we have rule of law and we have a new Trump administration that is favorable toward development. Also Zambia, you got to put Zambia in that, and that's a stable part of the copper belt of southern Africa. The problem in Zambia is power. They don't have any power. They got no way to get power. It's a landlocked country that has imports all its oil, and there's no easy solution for them with power. Where will the copper come from? Well, I mentioned copper oxides. But those are limited. We've seen this expanding growth of copper oxides now for about the last 30 years. But think about it. How many eroded, weathered copper deposits where you can take sulfide copper and make oxide copper through weathering? There's a limited supply of those. They have to be, number one, in semi-arid or historically wet, dry terrain, so you get the leaching of the copper. They have to have low pyrite compared to chalcopyrite, and so there's a limited expansion capability of copper oxides worldwide. We will no doubt mine lower and lower grades as time goes on. That's the history of mining in the world. As the time goes on in any commodity, you continually mine lower and lower grades because they become economic as you mine out all the high-grade deposits. The real key here, I think, is exploration. We need to get smarter. We need to look at buried deposits, and we need to look deeper. And the solution to that really is technology and innovation. I am a cornucopian as opposed to a Malthusian. A cornucopian is a scientist who thinks the world has whatever we need. When we need it, we can develop. We're not going to run out of copper. We're not going to run out of oil. We're not going to run out of gold. We're not going to run out of anything. Sometimes as geologists and engineers, we find too much. We're too successful. Anyway, so where's the copper coming from? We've got to find new companies. We've got to find deposits. If they're high grade, so much the better. And there are a few of those around. Why am I a copper bull? There are 85 million more people on this planet every year, and using current demand, each one of those persons is going to use 3 kilograms of copper. That's about 6.5 pounds of copper. That's a lot of copper, folks. 25% of those people go to bed in the dark and they get up when the sun comes up. They live in the dark. I've spent a significant amount of my exploration career in the third world without electricity. And so that's changing. It's changing mostly in Eastern Asia is where it's changing, but most of the world's population without electricity are in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think it's going to happen in Sub-Saharan Africa very soon, but it certainly is happening in China and India and other parts of Eastern Asia. 3.4% annual demand since 1900. That's not going to annual demand growth, I should say. That's not going to change. And demand growth is much greater than discovery and development. Remember, we got to find a Bingham Canyon every year. Every year. Junior company speculations. What are my criteria? A flagship property that's economic at $3.30 a pound, and that's generally accepted figure for a new development build out. Large high-grade sulfides or small copper oxides in geopolitical favorable jurisdictions. For me, that's North America. Tight share structure with insider holdings and technical and experienced successful managers. Got one more slide. So here's my compelling call on copper. Trilogy Metals, formerly Nova Copper, an upper-tier junior resource company in the Ambler Mining District of Alaska. 2 giant and high-grade deposits. The Arctic VMS, polymetallic, dominated about 50 or 60% of metal value in copper, and bornite, a sedimentary-hosted copper gold deposit. When you're speculating in any stock, you must beware of the frogs masquerading as princes. The company that's following me just happens to be my new pick on copper. Rick Van Nieuwenhuis is going to give a talk on Trilogy, and this company is a prince, in my opinion. I can be reached at this email address. We will have copies of my newest Mercenary Musing on Trilogy Copper at my booth and at Rick's booth immediate following his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mickey.
Thank you.